Hey friends, Pastor Bill Walden here with Build Up the Church. God bless you. I hope you're doing super great. This is a devotional word for November 14th, 2024. And this is out of Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 is known as the Hall of Faith. You know, professional sports have the Hall of Fame, and even rock and roll has the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Hebrews 11 is the Hall of Faith, the great people of the Bible that believed God even when it didn't seem reasonable to believe God. Before we get into this, I'm going to read through a lot of verses and just let the Bible do its own talking. But the idea about faith is not creating a situation, but hearing what God has said and believing that he's going to keep his promise, regardless of how it looks. I think it's the New International Version that says of Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, faith is being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you do not see. And when it says certain of what you hope for, that word hope in the New Testament, in the Greek language, means not kind of a passive resignation like, I hope God provides for me. I'm sitting on the couch. I'm, depressed. I'm complaining. I'm, overeating a gallon of ice cream because I'm in despair. Hope is having a confident expectation that something's going to happen. One Bible commentator put it this way: hope is like expecting somebody to show up at your house, but you're looking outside with an outstretched neck. You're expecting they're going to be here any minute. And so it's not a resigned resignation, hopeless despair kind of thing, but it's a confident expectation. Doesn't mean it's without its challenges, to be sure, but it's a confident expectation that God is going to do what he said he's going to do. So hope is not creating a scenario that God hasn't told you something's going to happen, but you just kind of come up with it in your mind. That's not biblical hope. That's not biblical faith. That's just having a great imagination. But faith in this chapter really is hearing from God and believing that he's going to do what he said he's going to do. So based on that, let me start in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. Going to hit some wonderful high points here in this great hall of faith. It was by faith that Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. Abraham, who had received God's promises that he would have a son and that he would have descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. Abraham, who had received God's promises, was ready to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. And God was testing him. He said, take your son up to Mount Moriah and there sacrifice him to me. This sounds horrible and morbid to us in these days that we live in, but it was not uncommon in ancient days for a parent to sacrifice the firstborn to try to win the favor of their local deity. So culturally, it was not an unheard of thing. God didn't intend for Abraham to do it, but he was testing him. But he had already told Abraham that he was going to give him descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. So we read the story here. Abraham, who had received God's promises, was ready to sacrifice his only son Isaac, even though God had told him, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life again. And in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. The knife was never plunged into his chest, but in some ways, Abraham expected him to be as good as dead, but God would revive him again. So Abraham was obeying, going against all of his emotions, believing the promise of God. It was by faith that Isaac promised the blessings for his future, for the future, to his sons Jacob and Esau. It was by faith that Jacob, when he was old and dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and bowed in worship as he leaned on his staff. It was by faith that Joseph, when he was about to die, said confidently that the people of Israel would leave Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. He even commanded them to take his bones with them when they left. He says, someday you're going to leave. When you do, take my bones with you and bury me in the promised land. He had an expectation because God had said that was going to happen. It was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. Pharaoh was killing all the firstborn there in Egypt, all the firstborn of the children of Israel. They saw that God had given them an unusual child. They were not afraid to disobey the king's commands. It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He expected something better. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward, all the promises that God had given him. It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. It was by faith that Moses commanded the people of Israel to keep the Passover, to sprinkle the blood on the doorpost so that the angel of death would not kill their firstborn sons. The 10th and final plague against Egypt, because Pharaoh would not release the Jewish people, was that they would take a Passover animal, kill the animal, put the blood on the uprights and over the doorposts, on the lintel, and down at the bottom of the door, and the angel of God would pass over those houses, but whichever house did not have the blood on it, the angel of death would come and take the firstborn, whether it be a human being or an animal. That had never happened before. There was no reason to think that it could or should. There was no reference point. But Moses had received a promise from the Lord, and he believed it, and they did it, and God brought them liberation. It was by faith that the people of Israel marched around Jericho for 7 days, and the walls came crashing down. There's a lot more here in Hebrews chapter 11. Going down to verse 35. Now the author talks about people who had faith in all the promises of God, even when they suffered for their faith. He says, verse 35, the second half, others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. They placed their hope, their confident expectation. Remember, hope is a confident expectation, not a wringing of the hands that maybe God's going to come through. But faith is not doing what your emotions would tell you to do, but doing what God has promised you. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. Some were jeered at, and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prisons. Some died by stoning, some were sawn in half, and others were killed with the sword. Some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats, destitute and oppressed and mistreated. I love verse 38. This is the New Living Translation. They were too good for this world. Oh man, what a statement. Because they were people of God, because they had faith in that which the unbelievers could never see or expect would happen. The unbelievers had no expectation that God would do any of these things, and they didn't care. But these were people of faith. These were people of hope. They did not let their emotions defeat them. They did not let the fear of suffering defeat them. They didn't invent something to believe in, but they received a word from God to believe in, and they believed it. Even when they were suffering, and the author here says, New Living Translation, they were too good for this world. I love that. They wandered over deserts and mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. All these people earned a good reputation, verse 39, because of their faith, yet none of them received all that God had promised. It was all pointing towards Jesus. For God had something better in mind for us, so that they would not reach perfection without us. He's comparing Jesus, the great high priest, to all the other high priests. He's comparing Jesus, the perfect sacrifice, to the blood of bulls and goats, showing the superiority of Jesus and urging them on to faith and reminding them that their forefathers had believed in something they had never seen, but they received the promise from God. So what's going on with you? What has God promised you? There's so many black and white promises for provision, guidance, comfort in the New Testament, on the Sermon on the Mount, all throughout the New Testament, so many promises of God. Don't be defeated by fear or by emotions or by peer pressure. Receive the promises of God, have a confident expectation, have an outstretched neck, and watch God come through. So some things to think about. Thanks for watching.